Socrates said an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe and share this podcast with family and friends, a show where we examine life contained with philosophies, ideas and their consequences on today's culture. I am Rainer Thermal and this is Hey Culture. Hello everyone and welcome back to Hey Culture. Back on today's episode for the second time is Dr. Carey Walton. Dr. Carey, welcome.
Hello. Thank you. It's fun to be back.
Yeah, I'm really excited for today's episode. For those of you who are new to the show or didn't watch the previous episode, Dr. Carey did her PhD in what we call the argument from desire, and she also does a talk on objective beauty, and that's what we spoke about last time around. So if you want to know more about her and also to know what she has to say about objective beauty, is beauty really in the eye of the beholder? Is it objective? Is it subjective? Is it either or? Go watch the previous episode we did. But for today's episode, Dr. Carey, as I just said, and I mentioned, the topic you did was the argument from desire. And I remember last time out, I asked you whether that's the same as Lewis's argument from joy. And you said it is similar. So maybe can you flesh that out a bit as to why did you decide on doing a dissertation on that, and what is it basically?
Okay. Well, it was just something that I was thinking about, and it just occurred to me as I was going through what am I going to do my dissertation on, that I'm very passionate about this subject, probably more passionate than any particular subject. So let's just dive into this and see if I can put some details around it, make a paper out of it. And it turned out to be a huge learning experience for me. I learned about the history of this subject in ways I didn't dream, that it had a backstory that I wasn't aware of. It had details that I never dreamt of. So it was a real pleasure to do the research and the writing and the interviews and all of that. And I think the reason I'm so excited about this subject is because it's been very meaningful to me in my own Christian walk, my connection with trying to understand my own reactions to goodness and truth and beauty, particularly as a young person. They were really profound in making me believe there was a spiritual realm and believe that God was personal and saw me and loved me. And so I felt kind of indebted to this experience, that I wanted to pass that on to other people and encourage them to think about it, because it does have a uniqueness to it. It's an argument that is sometimes used for the existence of God, but not in a way that is typical. When we think of arguments for the existence of God, particularly in apologetics, we tend to think of arguments that are a little more cerebral, the cosmological argument, the argument from first cause, the teleological argument, the argument from design, the moral argument, the fact that there's a moral law at work in the universe and we feel it pressing on us. So there suggests there's a moral lawgiver. Those kinds of things are good arguments. There's other arguments. But often, if people are not geared towards having sort of an intellectual exchange, that might not interest them, and it just might not be useful. Whereas this argument kind of comes in on a sort of a subtle level, and it hits people in a way that is emotional and personal, not threatening, not intellectual, but more existential. What is your experience? What have you felt? What have you experienced in terms of your deepest desires, your longings as a human being? And most people can identify with it. So it kind of opens up conversations with people who might not be interested in talking about the existence of God in other ways. And basically what the argument from desire is is that human beings, as a species, we human beings seem to have these deep persistent, mysterious desires that we harbor deep in our hearts for something perfect. We desire perfect goodness, perfect beauty, perfect love, perfect truth. We can't quite put our finger on it, but sometimes we have overwhelming experiences of desire for these things. And Lewis talked a lot about this throughout his own personal story. If you read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, Lewis is identified with this argument probably more than anybody else, because this was a real catalyst for him in spurring his spiritual journey. And he talks about one of his really early experiences when he was a young boy. He talks about coming into the backyard, his house in Ireland. He was Irish, and he was standing next to this red flowering currant bush, and it was a very beautiful bush. And for some reason, it triggered a memory in him of when he was even younger. He and his brother Warnie were playing in the nursery, the children's playroom at the old house, and he remembered this immediately when he saw this bush. His brother had brought this little toy biscuit tin in that he'd made into a toy garden. He'd taken this empty biscuit tin and put little plants and stuff in. And he brought this into the nursery to show Lewis, and it was just this sweet memory that he had of being a very young child, having this innocent time playing with his brother. And he said this memory just filled him with unbelievable joy and happiness and longing for something beautiful and good. And he couldn't quite put his finger on it. What was he longing for? But it was a deep longing. And in that experience, there was also this very subtle tinge of sadness with it. So it was a very peculiar mix of emotions: joy, longing, sadness. But it was very profound and very impactful. And Lewis says it just hit him like a 2x4 over the head. It just hit him, made him stop what he was doing. He said it was so enormous that he just wanted to grab onto that feeling and hang on to it, because even though it was a little sad, it was still beautiful. But as he was feeling this, he felt it sort of receding, and in just a few moments, the feeling was gone. And he said the world turned commonplace for him again. And he felt himself, thinking, what was that? What just happened to me? And he would experience that kind of encounter numerous times in his life, particularly as a young person. And it was almost always while he was doing something wonderful. He'd seen something beautiful, or he'd experienced something that was lovely. Like he used to love to read Norse mythology. And sometimes he'd be reading these stories, these folk tales of Norse mythology, and he'd just get hit with this feeling of this deep longing for the beauty of the North, and the coldness of the North, and the excitement and adventure of these stories, or something. He couldn't quite tell you what it was he wanted, but it was overwhelming. And then it would just dissipate and it would go. Or he'd be listening to the music of Wagner because he loved Wagner. And every once in a while, this feeling would hit him. And this is an actual thing that is experienced by people all over the world. It is universally experienced. And there's a word for it. And the word is Sehnsucht. It's a German word, Sehnsucht, Sehnsucht. And it means a deep longing for something mysterious and far off. And people in every culture talk about this experience. It's really universal. But what happened to Lewis is he really wanted to understand what this meant, because it was such a beautiful experience. It was something he wanted to have again and again. So it put him on a path to figure out what this was about, what was causing it, and how to get it back. And for him, it was one of the things that led him to search for what was true and good and beautiful. And all along his life, that was kind of his touchstone for something that was real and good and true. And even as an atheist, when he went through a period of time when he was an atheist, he still hung on to this sense of Sehnsucht as being something that was true and certainly felt spiritual. And eventually he came to believe that experience came from God, and what he was desiring, that mysterious something, that mysterious longing for perfection, that actually corresponds to an encounter with God. In other words, what he wanted more than anything, and what he says we all want, is not just a little bit of beauty, something good on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, justice every once in a while. We want all of these things all of the time, endlessly and perfectly. That's what our human nature calls out for. And the only place that you can find that, the only place that is a reality, is not on this earth, not in our daily existence, but in the presence of God, ultimately in heaven, when we get there and he is there, and there's no division between us. There's nothing separating us from God. There's nothing alienating us from what is pure goodness and ultimate truth and the substance of love. All of those things, that will be right there in our presence. And that's what we call God. So all of our deep longings will be met in that place. And Lewis says this experience is like a signpost. It's pointing us towards a reality that does exist, and we are meant to find it, but we're not meant to have it in this life. We're meant to seek it and search for it and eventually find it in an intimate love relationship with God. And then we start that relationship in this life, but it goes on and it culminates in our experience of God in heaven.
Oh wow, yeah, that's amazing. It reminds me, maybe it is the same thing, but just simplified. I remember as a boy in Sunday school, the Sunday school teacher would kind of make this statement saying that each person has a God-shaped hole in their heart. Is it basically the same thing?
Yes.
Okay.
That's an idea that French philosopher Blaise Pascal was working on. In fact, there's a very famous quote about him, from him, about this idea that there's this void inside every human being, and people call it the God-shaped hole. And it's this sense of neediness, this existential sense of neediness in every human person, a desire for something that is transcendent and good and perfect. And it whispers to us that we are meant to connect with that thing. And we tend to try to fill it with whatever we think is going to make us happy for a little while. People try to fill that emptiness, that sense of longing, with possessions, acquiring a lot of money or a lot of things, or they fill it up with activities to keep themselves busy, or lots of sexual encounters, or just all kinds of things, even doing good things, charity work, that kind of thing. And they think this is going to fill this neediness in me and make me feel satisfied, like my life is meaningful and fulfilling. But that only works for a tiny bit of time, and it never works forever. And often people feel more discouraged after they put all those things in, and they find that the fit isn't good. It's not enough, and it never lasts.
Well, that is so true. That is so true. So, why does Lewis specifically use the word joy? Because as you've explained it, it sounds like the word desire is more fitting, explaining that there's this need or something that we long or yearn for.
Mhm.
Why does Lewis specifically say it's the argument from joy or being surprised by joy?
Yeah, well, that was a name that he gave his experience. Early in Surprised by Joy, he talks about this Sehnsucht experience as a child, and he says, I call this joy, because that sort of embodied the experience for him. But he referred to it as a capital Joy. He named
Okay.
it joy. So you can treat it as a synonym for Sehnsucht, really, but that was his name for it, joy. And not only did joy surprise him that first time, but every time after it, that experience, but he was surprised at how meaningful it was and how important it was to his spiritual journey. And then he was surprised when the answer to his question about what's the source of this, what's the cause of this, he was surprised that that really was God, because he had a very simple faith as a very young child, but he lost his faith after the death of his mother, and then because of the suffering as a young child, or as a young man rather, he went into the First World War and saw horrible atrocities, and it just was like the nail in the coffin for him, and he turned his back on faith and really thought he was done with all of that. And then later in life, he started thinking about the possibility of God, and he liked the spiritual feeling of this encounter with joy, but he didn't know what to make of it because he had a godless paradigm. But it kept poking at him. It kept kind of prodding him to keep looking and keep thinking and keep searching for answers, because it was an intensely spiritual experience. And he tried some different things. He had a brief flirtation with the occult, actually. He embraced sort of a pantheistic view that God is part of everything and we're all part of God, but that didn't seem to answer the questions he had. It didn't match reality when he started pushing on it. There were problems with that system. And through conversations with friends of his at Oxford, when he was teaching at Oxford, he began to recognize that there was something about theism, the idea that there's a God outside of creation who has actually made us and can interact with us and wants us to be connected with him. And then in particular, Christian theism, the God of the Bible in particular is the one true God. He began to think that maybe this matched reality in a unique way, but he wasn't overjoyed by this. No pun intended. He wasn't really thrilled with the idea of having to become a Christian, because he really thought this was going to change his life in a negative way. It was going to interfere with his autonomy. And he really was reluctant about that. But he came to the place where he realized that these things were true, that Jesus really was was God, was divine, had a divine nature, and that the words of the Bible made sense and were historic and trustworthy. And he came to a place where he felt he had to acknowledge this and embrace it as true, but he didn't really want to. So when he made the connection and gave his life to Christ, he was actually kind of depressed by it because he was doing it because it was true, not because he really wanted to. But then he was surprised by the reality that this new relationship with the living God was the thing he wanted and had been searching for all along. The Lord just came into his life and filled him with the Holy Spirit and with hope and with contentment and with enthusiasm. And then it began this amazing journey of faith. And he was surprised at how exciting and fulfilling Christianity really was.
Yeah, that is. So when you say friends at Oxford, specifically, if I remember correctly, it was a conversation with JR talking.
Mm-hmm.
the author of Lord of the Rings, who said to Lewis, because like you mentioned earlier, Lewis was really into Norse mythology and mythology in general, and saying to him, but Jesus is the true myth, meaning he's not actually a myth, but he's true. I think, so if I understand you correctly, Lewis's joy experiences kind of paved the way and laid the foundation for basically when Tolkien kind of shared the gospel with him, that he was already ripe for it, if that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, I think that he was ripe for it, whether he knew it or not. But the thing about Lewis is he was a very intellectually honest person. He wanted something that was wondrous and exciting and beautiful, and his encounters with joy, with Sehnsucht, were all of those things, and the things that provoked those experiences, like listening to music, going to a symphony, or walking in the woods and seeing the beauty there, and he'd have this feeling. They were exciting when he'd read these stories in mythology. He was just filled with wonder and excitement, and he wanted to like be part of the story. That was wonderful and beautiful. But then he looked at religion and he thought, oh, this is exactly the opposite. This is dreary. This is dull. This is stiff. This is confining. And what I think Tolkien was trying to tell him is the reality is when you encounter the living God, not religion, not rules, but the living God, and you begin that relationship, and God comes into your life and begins to, remake you. That's what life is all about. That's exciting. That's the adventure you're looking for. And these stories and these things that the books that you read that usher in this feeling of Sehnsucht, they're just a means to introduce these realities to you. They're not the thing you're looking for. That feeling came through them, but it wasn't in them. The thing that you're looking for is actually in the God who made you and made you for a relationship with him. That relationship is the big adventure in life. So those feelings you have, they have an object. You desire to have that encounter, that relationship with what's good and true and beautiful and perfect and exciting. You want that. That really does exist. It exists in a relationship with God through Jesus. So these stories about Jesus in the New Testament, they're like the myths that you've been reading, and they have the same power to stir you and satisfy those desires. But the difference is, this is true. This is something you really embrace and pour your whole life into. And for some reason, talking like that about the gospel and the story of Jesus being true myth, that clicked for Lewis in a way that nothing else had. And it allowed him to think about the possibility of Jesus being the thing that he wanted, or the truth that he was looking for. So he wanted what was wondrous, for sure, but he also wanted what was true. And so he didn't go right home and like fall on his knees, and accept Christ, but he really started seriously looking at scripture, considering whether it could be true, whether the gospel message was coherent, whether it matched history, whether it was philosophically sound, all of that. And he came to the conclusion, not only was it wondrous, but it was also true. And that was something he could get behind. It had to be both for him.
Okay, that I can see why you were definitely interested in pursuing this as a dissertation with your PhD. It's really an amazing. It's totally different from anything else in apologetics, and beautifully so. So, as I understand, your master's you did through SES.
Mhm.
Did you do your PhD through them as well?
I did, yes.
Okay. Would you take us through, how did you structure it? Do you take us through your PhD process as to what specifically did you investigate or look at in the argument from desire?
Okay. Well, the first part of the paper was there was an introduction about man's desire, man's deep, inconsolable desires, and how this is such a feature across humanity. We all are looking to connect with what's good and true and beautiful, but like not in a passing way, in a comprehensive way. We really want that in our lives perfectly and completely, whether we understand it or not. And our experiences of desire are always kind of betraying that. And you find that written in literature, you find it written in poetry, in songs. There's just all kinds of evidence that this is a major preoccupation in the human race. In fact, one author I read said next to the topic of love, the topic of existential desire is the greatest theme in literature. And I would look at songs like there's U2 has a song called "I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For." There's a song, I came across a song by Michael Jackson and Freddie Mercury of Queen, believe it or not. In the 80s, they wrote a song called "There Must Be More to Life Than This." This is just something that is, we're hardwired to be looking for what our hearts really desire, what's true and good and beautiful and perfect. We want to be loved completely and cherished. We want to know things. We want to know truth. We want to know causes. We want immortality. That's something that is universal. All people want to live on. Even if they say they don't, they do. Extinction horrifies us, all of us. We want to continue to live on. And these things are just basic human longings. And I remember reading something by the Boston College philosopher, Peter Kraft, and he's done a lot of work on this subject, a lot more than me for sure. And he said we have kind of a lover's quarrel with the world. We love things about it. We enjoy the good things in this life, but they eventually let us down. We want more than anything the world really can give us. And in fact, he has taken Lewis's argument from desire. You see this showing up in Lewis's works, in Surprised by Joy, in Mere Christianity, in Pilgrim's Regress, in the Narnia books for sure. You see this story coming up in different ways, and he comes at it from different directions, from fiction, from philosophy, from apologetics, all kinds of different places. But Kraft has taken this argument and actually made it into a syllogism. And what he says basically is that every natural desire has some object of satisfaction. Every natural desire. Now, not all desires are natural. Some desires are more artificial. Artificial desires are those things that we develop because we see something on television, or our next door neighbor gets a new car, and then all of a sudden we want a new car. It's influenced by the culture, by the media, that kind of thing. But a natural desire is a desire that we all have, all healthy people have. And what it is it's something that comes up from what it means to be a human being. Like we have a natural desire to eat. So we want to eat, not because we just saw a commercial for, Chick-fil-A on television. We want to eat because we're the kind of creatures that need to eat. That's a natural desire. If we don't eat, we won't live, we won't grow, we won't flourish. We all have a natural desire to sleep. a natural desire to have friendships and relationships and sexual encounters. Those things are part of what it means to be human. And he says every natural desire has a corresponding object of satisfaction. In other words, we get hungry, there's such a thing as food. And Lewis actually talks about this. He makes these same kind of statements. We get tired, well, there's such a thing as sleep. So those things, they match up. The desire matches up with the object. That's a natural desire. And then, so that's the first premise, that every natural desire has an object of satisfaction. But the second premise is that we find in ourselves a desire for something that nothing on earth, nothing in time, no creature, no other human being can satisfy. And it's this desire for some mysterious something. And Kreeft says, let's just call it X. You might call it perfection. We can't really pin it down, but we want perfect goodness, perfect love, perfect beauty, perfect relationship. We want to be loved and cherished perfectly. We want to live on. But we find that nothing in this world meets that, fulfills that desire. And the third point, or the conclusion basically, is that there must be something more than time, material things, creatures, other people. There must be something more that will satisfy those desires. And the thing that ultimately will satisfy our desires for perfection, for wholeness, for completeness, for perfect purpose and meaning and goodness and beauty, the thing that really does correspond to that it will satisfy us completely, is God. That's the only thing that meets that criteria. And some people have said, well, maybe it's life forever with God. In other words, you might think of it as God, you might think of it as life with God forever in heaven. So it might be an argument for God, it might be an argument for heaven. But the idea is we don't have these feelings, these drives, these inescapable desires. We don't have them for no reason. They really do correspond to something that exists. And that thing is the perfect love relationship with God that we were designed to have, to start in this life and then enjoy forever with him in heaven. So the first part of the paper looked at how people have been looking at this question throughout history. And it looks at Plato and how Plato had the image of the cave, where people are in this cave and all they see is shadows of things, but they don't see the things in themselves. But they can leave the cave. If they can get out of the cave and go up, they can see there's a whole real world out there, and that's what they really want. What they've been stuck in the cave looking at is these shadows of reality. So we look at that in this paper, and then we look at Augustine. And Augustine was a fascinating guy, and he's the one that is often quoted regarding this desire question. He has this very famous quote that he says, "Lord, you stir in us a desire to worship, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." So Augustine was very aware of this question of existential desire, and he wrestled with it himself as a young man before he had a conversion to Christianity. Nothing was ever good enough. Nothing ever filled that emptiness in his life until he came to Christ. So that's another way to look at it, that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God, in Jesus. And Aquinas had a version of the argument from desire. Pascal, you mentioned the God-shaped hole. So this has been something that people have been thinking and talking about, through history. But Lewis, I think, with his unique talents, was able to express it very clearly and evocatively, particularly in the Narnia books. There are some images of this in the Narnia books, and So he was able to convey it in a way that was really very striking. And also Pilgrim's Regress. This is all over the place in Pilgrim's Regress. So Kreeft came along and actually made more of like a philosophical syllogism with it. So that was kind of the first part of the book. And then the second part was looking at happiness and how happiness is connected with our desires. You know, we want to be happy, but what is happiness? It's something more, much more than just the sort of the shallow contentment that a lot of, certainly a lot of Americans think of as happiness. You know, just having what you want right now and no big problems, that's happiness. But happiness, classically understood, is much bigger and much more exciting. It has to do with being fulfilled as a human being, being what you ought to be as a human being. And that tells us that we have a nature that is meant to be a certain thing. And if it doesn't develop into that thing, if it doesn't grow and become the thing it's supposed to be, we won't be fulfilled. We won't be happy. We won't have a life well lived. So we're always looking for what's going to make us happy. And there's lots of things that can make us happy for a little while, but they're not things that are going to lead to our flourishing as human beings. And God wants us to flourish as human beings. He wants us to be the people he made us to be. And ultimately, we only have that when, again, we're in a love relationship with him through Christ. And so in seeking happiness through all these different avenues, through gaining wealth or having lots of relationships or lots of fun, recreational activities, these kind of things that people put in their lives to make it seem meaningful, we're missing the point. They can be stepping stones to figuring out what real happiness is and how we find it. But often what they are ways to just push these feelings away, quiet these existential desires. You know, it's that idea that there's this God-shaped hole in our hearts, and that hole is meant to be filled with God. And that's where our happiness really lies. So I look at that kind of a thing in a second part of the chapter. And I look at Sehnsucht. I think that's probably the third part in particular, and how that shows up in people's lives, this experience of longing. And it shows up in crazy ways. It shows up sometimes when you just have a memory, you know, like you smell some food that's you're at somebody's house, and you smell some food and you think immediately of a time when you were a child. It reminds you of some smell. You remember that smell. Somebody used to cook that. And you think about how safe your life was when you were a little kid, and how happy, you know, you were, and how the whole world was ahead of you, whatever. So smells can trigger this experience, or music, or just even looking up into the night sky. You see all the, you know, innumerable stars, you know, gazillions of stars, and you have just a sense of transcendence. Like you want to connect with this thing, something that's big and beautiful and true and wondrous. It's overwhelming. There's lots of different triggers, but they're very personal and they're very unique. And I think that they can be very powerful in the lives of people, particularly those people who are searching or skeptical. They don't have a personal faith, but they have these experiences, and they feel like somebody or something sees them and has given them this experience of transcendence and an ability to feel this extra dose of wonder and joy. And it feels like a gift. And I think for some people, this is very, very meaningful, because it allows them to think past the here and the now and think, well, I just had an experience of something transcendent and true and glorious. I don't know what that means, but I want to follow that. I want more of that. So I think that the idea that these things happen are very useful, because if you're willing to kind of follow it and think, well, where did that come from, and what does it mean, and what's the source of that? What's the source of that joy I felt? What's the source of that beauty? I want to connect with that beauty, but where is it coming from? It can kind of help people, particularly people who have a materialistic perspective. Like they don't believe there is a God. They don't believe that there is heaven or hell or angels or the supernatural, but yet they've had these experiences and they sure feel spiritual. And they might not say they are spiritual. They might not go that far, but they feel spiritual. So it kind of makes a little crack in the armor of a person's worldview if they have closed themselves off from the possibility of God or heaven or a spiritual life. It puts a crack in that for a lot of people. So I looked at that and some experiences that people have, some kind of examples and case studies of people who were really changed by this. I think of one story I read, and this is a really short story, but it was written by a Catholic priest. His name was Father Martin, and he talked about this lady that he met who came to a baptism. Her friend had had a baby, and she had invited her to the baptism. And this woman was not a believer. She wasn't religious at all. She was a self-professed workaholic, hadn't been to church in years, but she came to the baptism because it was her friend's baby. And the woman, when she was watching the priest pour the water over the baby's head, she said she was just overwhelmed with this feeling of joy and a feeling of peace and a desire to live a centered, peaceful life. And she actually started crying, like right there in the baptism. This lady just started crying. And she was talking to Father Martin later about this experience. And she said, well, I don't know what that means. I guess I was just being emotional. And she was very dismissive of it. But Father Martin said, to him anyway, it seemed very clear that at this moment when her defenses were down and she was seeing something that was holy and beautiful and sacred, that God sort of snuck in and allowed her to feel the beauty of that moment. And I think allowed her to feel his love for her. And I think that that's the way this works. I think God allows us to feel an extra sense of the goodness that he has put in this world. He allows us to get an extra emotional dose of it. So we feel it in a way that normally we don't feel it, so that we begin looking for the source of that goodness. And ultimately, we find our way to him because he is the source of it.
Wow. Sure. That is really amazing. What then would be, I almost want to say, the practical outworkings of your dissertation and from this argument? What I mean by it, practically in ministry, or if you would, I was thinking about talking as a friend, getting Lewis to Christ. How does this argument from desire impact ministry and counseling, even relationally, and relationally? How does it impact that practically, do you think?
Well, I think it's intriguing to people. And I think people are I've found anyway, that people are willing to talk about this because this is a conversation, a spiritual conversation that they've never had before. And I remember talking to Peter Kraft. I talked to him. I had an interview with him when I was researching this. And he's taught philosophy for years. And he remembers one class where he was doing some philosophy for some college, and a lot of the people in the class were just taking it because it was a required thing. They had to get those credits. They weren't there because they necessarily loved philosophy or were interested. And he would teach all of the, the various arguments for the existence of God as part of the philosophy thing. And when he got to this argument, the argument for God from desire, he saw people in the class sit up, and the ones that weren't terribly interested suddenly were much more interested. And he talked to some of them afterwards, and one guy said, yeah, I'm a musician, and I have those feelings when I play music or when I listen to music. I feel alive. I feel like I'm connecting with something that's beautiful, and it grabs me, and I it's like it takes me out of myself for a minute. And he said, I know what you're talking about. I didn't think that had anything to do with God. So he has found that this talking to people, having a conversation about these things, often is very useful in getting people to entertain the idea that God is working in their lives to draw them to himself. People sometimes think they've never had a spiritual experience. Like that lady at the baptism, she might say, I was just being emotional. But I think this is a genuine spiritual experience. And I think it's helpful when people consider that possibility, that the spiritual realm exists and that they are meant to be connected to it. So it opens avenues for thinking productively about the personal nature of God, how God loves you, and he sees you. He sees your deepest desires, and he wants to satisfy them because you are made for him. That's why you exist, to find your fulfillment and to enjoy him forever. So I think you can use this in ministry. I think best used, it's employed in conversation, just casual conversation. And you could ask someone, have you ever had an experience of intense joy where you just were overwhelmed? You just felt like lifted out of yourself for a moment, and it was so beautiful. You were filled with longing and a little sadness. Has that ever happened to you? And can you tell me about it? What provoked that? What were you doing at that time? And do you think it might mean something? And just get them talking. And you could ask, all kinds of questions, all the extravagant beauty in the world, and how it's so impactful. We don't just want beauty. We need it. We need beauty in our lives, or we don't flourish as human beings. So that's when doctors tell you, when you're feeling depressed, go for a walk in the woods, go to an art museum. It's good for you because it actually is genuine goodness. So now you could ask somebody, why do we need beauty? Why do we need that so badly? And doesn't it suggest something deeper, something more consequential than just the material world? I mean, if all there is in this world is matter and energy, there is no God, there is no spiritual reality, then why isn't everything just gray? Why is there so much extravagant beauty, and why does it affect us the way it does? You might even ask somebody, are you happy? Are you happy? And just be quiet and see what they say. It might really be an opportunity for them to share things about their own longings and what they want in life, how they're looking for it in all different places, and it's not there. And it might be an opportunity for you to share your testimony. So I think it's useful. The argument for desire it's not going to prove the existence of God. It's not meant to do that. But I think it's meant to start conversations. It's meant to be a pointer. And this is something Peter Kraft says. He says, these desires that we have, they're so profound, they're so meaningful, they're so loud, we can't shut them up. He said they're like pointers to something. This is important. Follow this. This means something. And I think that's a good way to look at it. That's
Okay.
why I think it's valuable as a tool in your toolbox.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think because it is kind of putting on the heartstrings, I think because it's touching people in something that they can relate to.
Yeah.
Whereas you can just shrug off an intellectual argument. People can ignore it, they can shrug it off, because the majority of people aren't always intellectually honest. But something that hits home, something that hits that strikes a nerve, and I don't mean it in a bad sense, but touches somebody, and it's as if it's the conversation is becoming real,
Mm-hmm.
and authentic, and it's harder for people to shrug that away than I think just shutting off towards an intellectual argument. I think the intellectual arguments do a lot to show, indicate the existence of God, and to make it beyond a reasonable doubt. But I think this argument from desire, in terms of, I almost want to say, breaking down the barriers within people, I think that could be too. I think it can play a big role in that too.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. I think it does break down barriers, because I think we all have these encounters, and what provokes them is different for everybody. Like, I remember talking to a young lady who, we had a discipleship group at my house for years. It was for high school age kids, and I was talking about this experience of saint soaked, and I said, it can come over you when you're walking in the woods, or when you're at an art museum, you're listening to music. And she was just kind of like, yeah, okay. And I said, or even like mathematics. Some people, they do mathematics and they get all excited, and they have this, and she looked at me like, oh, yes. Because she'd had that experience for whatever reason. That's so not me. I don't have that experience with mathematics. But there's a beauty to mathematics. It's elegant. When you understand how these mathematical formulas fit together, and they express truth, and they're transcendent. 1 + 1 is 2 in any universe. It's mind-blowing. And so she had a reaction to that. So she connected. So it's really very personal, and that's a beautiful thing about it. That our God is so personal. He deals with individuals as if they're the only ones he ever made. He's able to do that. And I find that exciting. So yeah, it's uniquely able to talk to people where they are.
That's amazing. That is really amazing. Is there anything else that you would like to add for the listeners and the viewers with regards to the argument from desire?
Oh, not really. But a good introduction, if you're interested, Google Peter Kraft, and he has some things. I think you can find them online. He's got a little passage on this in his apologetics. He's got a book on apologetics. He's got a couple pages on this. There's not that much written on it, tell you the truth. You could read Mere Christianity. The chapter on hope deals with this, but there's not a whole lot that's been written. A couple people have done some work, but I think the quickest way to go is to find Mere Christianity. You can get it online and read the chapter on hope. That's what I would do, because Lewis has a great way of explaining it. Nobody could put things into words like him. So that would be a good start.
I think it's because he is a poet, and because wasn't he a linguistic professor? Like, he was into into poetry and fiction and mythology.
Well, he loved those things. By profession, he was an expert in literature.
Yeah.
Renaissance literature, I think, the classics, but he definitely was a poet. He had a poet's heart. He was a published poet. So yeah, he understood the lyrical nature of our experiences and was able to kind of put those very mysterious things into words in ways that most people really struggle with.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing how God can use individuals like that and for that purpose. Well, Dr. Carey, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this a lot. Once again, fun. Yeah, it was fun, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a gift the Lord has given you, but once again, it kind of, in our conversation, it creates a sense of awe of God. It almost feels like going to church in a sense, and I don't mean that in the worldly sense of making small of going to church. I'm meaning really like it feels like as if the Holy Spirit's presence is within the conversation. I think also it's because of I really do think it's a gift that God has given you, and I've enjoyed the conversations a lot.
I have too. This was fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And to the audience, hopefully this is not the last time that we've spoken to each other on air, but this is Hey Culture. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm René Fermor, and this is Hey Culture.